We have a couple of boys with us today who are exploring the history of our family in Michigan with Grandpa. And with them is a pretty little girl who will not be exploring with us, but we wanted to see her because she is so pretty. So how long have you boys lived in Michigan?
Almost a year. Almost here this time. The first time Titus lived here for only a few weeks, but I lived here for about 2 years.
So this is the first house that Antonin and Titus lived in. Antonin lived here for almost 2 years, and Titus lived here for just a few weeks. And Talia has lived in this house for the very first time, and this is their house in Berrien Springs, Michigan. So how many generations of our family have lived in Michigan, boys?
8.
So you are the 8th generation of our family to live in Michigan, and the 6th generation of the Hamstra family to live in Michigan. So let's see what we can learn about earlier generations of our family in Michigan. The story of the Wilson family in Michigan begins in Beverly Hills. Beverly Hills, Michigan is in the northern edge of Southfield Township in Oakland County between Pontiac and Detroit. Where we are standing right now is at the corner of Lasser Road and 14 Mile Road. 14 Mile Road forms the northern boundary of Southfield Township and of the town of Beverly Hills. Ebenezer Wilson Jr., known as Major Ebenezer Wilson, moved to this farm sometime between 1825 and 1828. Accounts differ as to when he actually moved. He was born in Vermont around 1780 and married in Vermont Catherine Bowers, who was born in New Jersey. We can trace the ancestry of Major Ebenezer Wilson through his mother Lydia Rowley all the way back to Samuel Fuller, who arrived as a boy on the Mayflower and was orphaned soon after and then raised by his uncle, who was also named Samuel Fuller. We can trace the ancestry of Catherine Bowers through her father, Samuel Bowers, back to Reverend John Bowers, who graduated from Harvard in 1649, and his father, George Bowers, who was a shipbuilder in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Ebenezer and Catherine had 2 children in Vermont, a daughter, Louisa, who was born around 1802, and the son, Ebenezer Wilson III, who in Michigan was called Ebenezer Wilson Jr. Then they moved along with the rest of the Wilson clan to Middlebury, New York, in what was then Genesee County and became Wyoming County. They were the founders of the village of West Middlebury and of the Baptist church there. Ebenezer and Catherine had a total of 6 children, 2 born in Vermont and 4 more born in West Middlebury, New York. Of those 6 children, one daughter, Irina, died a couple of days after she was born and is buried in West Middlebury. All of the rest of the children moved to Michigan. Sometime around 1826, Catherine Bowers died, and by 1828, Ebenezer had remarried a widow named Samantha Van Epps, who was a family friend in New York. Whether Catherine died in New York or in Michigan, we do not know. We do not find her in the cemetery in West Middlebury, and therefore she may have died shortly after they moved to Michigan. Ebenezer Wilson came from a family with a strong military tradition. His grandfather, Michael Wilson, his father, Ebenezer I, and 4 of his uncles all fought in the Vermont militia during the American Revolution. And his father-in-law, Samuel Bowers, fought in the New Jersey militia during the American Revolution. Ebenezer II was a major in the New York militia during the War of 1812 and was commended for meritorious service in one of the very last battles fought on Canadian soil at Fort Erie in Ontario. In the very last day of the Battle of Fort Erie, he led one of the sorties against the British. He was captured, taken to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and returned at the end of the war. Family legends going back to the 1870s say that Ebenezer Wilson had an uncle, Samuel Wilson, who fought in the American Revolution. However, none of his uncles were named Samuel. The legend apparently arose from his father-in-law, Samuel Bowers, who also fought in the American Revolution. Major Ebenezer Wilson bought 80 acres of farmland running north and south along the northeast boundary of Section 4. Today, the northeast corner of this property is a church, and the parking lot for the church is where we are filming. To the west of Major Wilson's farm, his son Ebenezer III farmed 57 acres. Ebenezer III married either in New York or Michigan, we do not know which. He had a son, Ebenezer IV, and 3 daughters while living in Michigan. We do not know when Ebenezer II died. The last record we have of him was when he applied for a disability pension from the U.S. Congress in 1834. It appears that he died here in Michigan somewhere between 1834 and 1840 because we have no record of him in the 1840 census. Likewise, we do not know what happened to Samantha Van Epps, his second wife. We do not know the name of Ebenezer III's first wife. We do know that the last of his daughters, Catherine, was born in Michigan in the early 1840s. Shortly after Catherine was born, his first wife died, and Ebenezer III took his children and moved to Batavia, Illinois, where most of the rest of the Wilson clan had migrated from Middlebury, New York. There, Ebenezer married a widow named Salome Mead, and they had one more daughter, Mary Salome Wilson. We will learn more about Ebenezer III later in this series. To the east of Ebenezer II's farm was the farm of Eli Curtis. Eli Curtis was a very prosperous farmer. In addition to the farmland in Southfield Township, he owned farmland in northern Ohio. Eventually, Ebenezer II's land was sold to Eli Curtis. Eli Curtis built a new farmhouse on the west side of the section line, and eventually, when the farms were split again, the boundary angled to the west for the last half mile of what is now Lasser Road, and that is why Lasser Road to this day runs on an angle for its last half mile. A fact that used to puzzle me when I was in my late teens and drove by this intersection many times. I had no idea in those days that I was driving past the farm where my first ancestors in Michigan had lived 140 years earlier. We are standing in the southwest corner of Shelby Township. In the 1830s, this was part of Oakland County, but later on, this area and the area east of it was split off into Macomb County. We're south of Auburn Road, right near Tanzanite Boulevard.
Is that Tanzanite?
Tanzanite is this street going right down here.
What street is this?
This little street with no street sign is called Citron. Where we are right now could be described as a failed subdivision. This land was developed, roads were put in, utilities were put in, all underground. It was intended for upper middle class homes, but nothing was ever built here. Looking off in the distance to the south, the larger buildings that you see are multi-story condominiums. They are actually very nice residences, and between us and them is a large man-made lake or pond. This failed subdivision was meant to be nice houses on the north shore of the pond. Looking off more to the west, we have a row of trees, and beyond those trees are several roads with nice middle-class residences on them. In 1832, Ebenezer Wilson Jr., Samuel B. Wilson, and Rollie W. Wilson, the 3 Wilson brothers, purchased this land from the U.S. government. The land they purchased is bounded on the northwest by Auburn and Huling, and on the southeast by Melton and Cumberland. It was 78 acres. It has obviously been divided since then. It was mostly forested with wetlands in the southeast part of the property when they bought it. There's no evidence that Ebenezer Jr., who was known as Ebenezer III, ever actually lived here. He lived on his 57-acre farm next to his father. So why did he sign the title for this property? The answer is that Samuel and Rollie were teenagers and they could not own property by themselves as minors. An adult had to be one of the owners of the land. Samuel and Rollie, probably with some help from another person we will hear about later, logged this land, cleared it, turned it into farmland, and then they sold it. By 1835, Samuel had moved north to Oxford. Rollie, we don't know exactly when he moved, but we do know that before 1840 he had returned to the state of New York and was probably living with his Wilson relatives there. In January of 1840, Rollie married Adeline Harrington in New York. Within a year, they had moved to Illinois, probably somewhere near his uncles and cousins who lived there. In 1842, Adeline and her baby daughter died of complications of childbirth, and shortly thereafter, Rollie married Adeline's sister, Eveline Harrington. Before 1844, Rollie and Eveline had moved to the extreme northwest corner of Illinois, Joe Davis County, north of Galena, Illinois. Right on the border with Wisconsin Territory is where they lived. They had two sons there, Albert and George, and in 1849 or 1850, Rollie headed to California in the gold rush, left his wife, who was pregnant with their third son, and two little boys, and Eveline and the boys lived across the line in the Wisconsin Territory until Rollie came back and got them in 1851. Rollie did not dig for gold in California. He took his family back there and he ran an inn, and he also worked as a money changer. Now, being a money changer was an important job in California because in those days there was no standard currency. Banks, states, everybody issued currency, and Rollie exchanged currency for gold and gold for currency. While they were living in California, they had a daughter, Ava. After the Civil War, Rollie took his family north to Salem, Oregon. He became a prominent merchant in Salem, was elected to the Oregon legislature, and when he died in 1877, he had a very large funeral in Portland and then a funeral procession to the Salem Pioneer Cemetery in Salem, where he is buried. Much of what we know about the history of the family from this period we learned from the published obituaries of Rollie Wilson. We are in the Pine Lake Cemetery on Middle Belt Road, just north of Lone Pine Road. We are in the eastern edge of West Bloomfield, Oakland County, Michigan, southwest of Pontiac a few miles. This cemetery is best known to Detroit area sports fans as the final resting place of Norm Cash, who was an all-star first baseman with the Detroit Tigers back in the 1960s, but that's not why we're here. We're here to study the history of the Wilson sisters, the daughters of Major Ebenezer Wilson. But we will start with one of the original settlers in this area, whose name was John Ellenwood. John Ellenwood bought 65 acres of land from the U.S. government on the shores of Pine Lake in 1825, and around the same time his son Ebenezer Ellenwood bought 45 acres just north of his father's property. John Ellenwood was a very prominent citizen of his area. In addition to local offices, he served in the territorial legislature and on both of the Michigan constitutional conventions. In September of 1830, Lucinda Wilson, who was the youngest daughter of Major Ebenezer Wilson and Catherine Bowers, married Ebenezer Ellenwood. The marriage lasted only a short time because less than 6 months later, Ebenezer died, and he was buried in this cemetery. He was the first person buried in this cemetery. In October of 1834, Lucinda Wilson Ellenwood married Burgess Calkin, or Calkins. He went by both names. At the time they got married, Burgess was living in Shelby Township and quite possibly was working with Lucinda's brothers on their land there. Burgess and his brother Haman Calkins also owned land in Southfield Township, a few miles away from where Lucinda's father and brother had their farms. Lucinda and Burgess had 3 daughters, Catherine, Ruth, and Julia. The Calkins family lived in Oakland County around Shelby, Sterling, Southfield until the 1850s when they moved to Kent County, Michigan, and then later they moved north to the area around Greenville and Edmore, Michigan. They still have descendants alive today. The oldest daughter of Ebenezer Wilson and Catherine Bowers was Louisa Wilson. She was born in Vermont around 1802. Around 1820, she married a gentleman named Adolphus Gould, who was older than she and possibly had been widowed. Before 1830, Louisa and Adolphus and their 2 daughters moved from New York to Oakland County, Michigan. Initially, they settled in Southfield Township, not far from the farms of her father Ebenezer and her brother Ebenezer. Sometime in the 1840s, after her father died and her brother moved to Illinois, Louisa and Adolphus moved to Commerce Township, which is a little ways west of here. They spent the rest of their life in Commerce Township, and their children and grandchildren lived in the West Bloomfield and Commerce Township area for several generations and are buried at the cemetery in Commerce Township, which we are not going to visit. They also have descendants alive today. We are in Oxford, Michigan, a little ways north of Pontiac. Samuel B. Wilson was the middle son of Major Ebenezer Wilson and Catherine Bowers. He was born in 1813 in West Middlebury, New York, and he was one of my great-great-grandfathers. Samuel built the first frame house in Oxford, Michigan, just north of here, around 1835. In 1837, Samuel bought this property, 80 acres of land along the south side of what is now Drowner Road, running between Pontiac Road and Olive Street. In the same year, his brother-in-law Burgess Calkins and Burgess's brother Haman Calkins bought a lot more acreage a few miles away from here. Today, this land is occupied by a retreat center and a subdivision of very nice houses. After clearing this land, he sold it and moved back to New York and lived with or near his relatives. In August of 1841, Samuel married Susan Anna Newton in Darien, Genesee County, New York. Susan was born in March of 1818. Her parents were John Newton and Anna Cole. There are family legends that she was a descendant of Isaac Newton, and indeed this is correct. Both her grandfather and her great-grandfather were named Isaac Newton. However, she was not a descendant of the famous Isaac Newton. Shortly after they married, Samuel Wilson and Susan Newton headed off to Illinois. They eventually found their way to northwestern Illinois or southwestern Wisconsin, in the same area that Samuel's younger brother Rolly had settled. In 1844, their first son, Henry William Wilson, who was my great-grandfather, was born either in northwestern Illinois or in the Wisconsin Territory, but in any case near Galena, Illinois. In 1847, their second son, Charles Edgar Wilson, was born in Illinois. After that, they returned to Oakland County, Michigan. They lived in Royal Oak Township for a little while, and shortly after they arrived back in Oakland County, they adopted a daughter, Harriet Anna Stanley, who was an orphan born in Macomb County, Michigan. In 1853, they had a third son, James Lester Wilson, and around this same time, they moved to Ottawa County, Michigan. We are in the extreme northwest corner of Lyon Township in Oakland County, Michigan. Where we are is the Green Oaks Cemetery, which is actually in the ghost town of Kensington, Michigan. This cemetery is located on the south side of Grand River Avenue between Kent Lake Road and the Huron River Bridge, in the northeast corner of Island Lake Park. Kensington was founded in the 1830s by land speculators. It straddles the location where the Grand River Road crossed the Huron River. To the east lies the town of New Hudson in Oakland County, and immediately to the west is Green Oak Township in Livingston County. Within 30 years, the town was largely abandoned. In 1946, a dam was built a little ways downstream across the Huron River. Behind the dam was formed what is now Kent Lake, and Kent Lake covers at least half or more of the ghost town of Kensington. When our family lived in this area, I, along with other young people from our church, camped in Island Lake Park, and many times we hiked the trails in Island Lake and Kensington Park, which is just north of us. However, that is not why we were here. 3 counties come together near this spot: Oakland County, Livingston County, and Washtenaw County. And in this area, 3 families came together who married each other and became our relatives. The families were the Houtling family, the Stanzel family, and the Taylor family, and we will learn more about these families in this cemetery. Garrett Houtling and his wife Lydia Gates were married in the state of New York in 1820. Their oldest son William was born in 1821. In 1825, they moved to Michigan. They bought land in Livonia, first 40 acres and later another 80 acres. In Livonia, their second son Samuel was born. Around 1830, they moved to Lyon Township and bought 200 acres of land. And after Lydia died in 1835, Garrett remarried, moved across the county line into Green Oak Township, and bought another 300 acres of land. Garrett died there in 1845. We believe that Garrett Houtling and Lydia Gates, his first wife, are both buried in the cemetery. However, there is no way to know for sure because the grave markers are gone. Descendants of Garrett Houtling and his 2 wives still live in southern Michigan. Nicholas and Henry Stanzel were brothers. Their father's name was also Nicholas Stanzel. Nicholas the father and his brothers fought in the New York militia during the American Revolution on the frontier in New York. 2 of their brothers, their oldest brother and their youngest brother, were ambushed by the Indians and killed near the Stanzel family farm. Henry the son came to Wayne County, Michigan in 1826 and settled in Plymouth Township. 10 years later, in 1836, he bought land in Green Oak Township in Livingston County, and he and his wife lived there for the rest of their lives. Some of their children remained around Green Oak, and some of the others moved elsewhere. including a number of their children and grandchildren who moved to Riley in Clinton Township, Michigan, just west of Grand Ledge, and lived there for several generations. Henry's older brother Nicholas and his second wife Susanna Erskine Thayer moved to Green Oak Township in 1837 from New York State. Both Nicholas and Susanna were widowed and had large families of children from prior marriages, some of whom also moved to Michigan. However, we will only talk about the children of Nicholas and Susanna because they are the ones who are most closely related to us. Their first son, Jacob Baker Stanzel, was born around 1824 in New York State and died in 1896 in Colorado. Jacob bought a farm near Howell, Michigan, and farmed there for a few years. Then, sometime in the 1850s, he and his wife moved to Waukegan, Illinois, north of Chicago. In 1861, Jacob Baker Stanzel and two partners went to Colorado to look for gold, and they found it. They became the owners of the Phillips mine and struck it rich. However, Jacob's riches did not bring him happiness. When he returned to Waukegan, Illinois, he and his wife divorced. Jacob soon remarried and returned to Colorado, where he spent the rest of his life in the gold fields. Fidelia Stanzel was born in New York around 1825 and died in Grand Rapids, Michigan in 1903. She married William Orson Huddling, who was one of the sons of Garrett Huddling, and they lived for about 10 years in Green Oak, and then sometime in the 1850s they moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where they lived for the rest of their lives. They had a large family, and many of their children or descendants are still alive today. Both Nicholas Stanzel and his wife Susanna died in Green Oak Township sometime in the late 1840s. We know only the date when Nicholas' estate entered probate. They had one young son, Eliab, who died in Michigan before his parents died, and they also left an orphan daughter, Chloe, who was a teenager. Chloe was born around 1831 in New York State, and she died in Michigan in 1902. After James Taylor's first wife died, he married Chloe Stanzel as his second wife. James Taylor was one of my great-great-grandfathers, and Chloe therefore would be my step-great-great-grandmother. Gamaliel Taylor was born around 1858 near Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island. He fought in the U.S. Army at the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. After the Battle of Saratoga, he remained in Dutchess County, New York, and in 1782 he married Anna Losey. Around 1782 or 1783, their oldest son, Abraham Losey Taylor, was born. They had several more children born to them in New York, and in the 1790s they moved to Ontario, Canada, where some of the other Loseys had settled. In 1810, Abraham Losey Taylor married Abigail Bell. Abigail's father and both of her grandfathers were also from upstate New York. However, they were loyalists, and they fought for the British during the Battle of Saratoga. One of Abigail's grandfathers was killed during the retreat by the British after the battle. After the British retreated from upstate New York, they relocated a lot of loyalist families into Ontario. They resettled these people around the Bay of Quinte, which is at the extreme northeast end of Lake Ontario. It was there that Abraham Losey Taylor and Abigail Bell married in 1810. From this we can learn that descendants of Abraham Taylor and Abigail Bell qualify both to be sons of the American Revolution or daughters, and also to be members of the United Empire Loyalists Association of Canada, providing that they would swear allegiance to the Queen. Abraham Taylor and Abigail Bell had several children, in Ontario, the first of whom was James Hugh Taylor, my great-great-grandfather. Sometime in the 1820s, they moved back to New York State, and their youngest daughter, Ruth, was born in 1832 in New York State. Around 1835, Abraham Taylor, Abigail Bell, and at least 4 of their children moved to Michigan. Initially, they lived in Wayne County, Michigan, but by 1840, Abraham and Abigail and some of their children had settled in Lyon Township, which is where we are right now. Around 1848, John Duncan Taylor married Elizabeth Gates, who was the daughter of one of the founders of Kensington. They lived near Kensington, but only briefly, because in 1849, Elizabeth Gates died after giving birth to their daughter, Elizabeth Taylor. The daughter, Elizabeth, died within a year. Both the mother and the daughter are buried in this cemetery, although we do not have grave markers. Ruth Eleanor Taylor was born in New York in 1832. In 1847, she married Samuel Gates Houghteling, brother of William Houghteling and son of Garrett. They lived in Green Oak Township for about 10 years, and she died in Green Oak Township in 1858. She is probably buried in the cemetery, although, again, we cannot know. We are exploring a cemetery in New Hudson, Michigan. This cemetery is on the west side of Milford Road between the I-96 interchange and Grand River Avenue. In this cemetery are buried my great-great-great-grandmother Abigail Bell Taylor and 2 of her children. There is a large monument here that on one side has the name Taylor and on the other side has the name Bell. And the grave markers around this monument are the grave markers of my relatives who are buried here. Unfortunately, most of them are so badly weathered that we cannot determine which one is which. Abigail Bell Taylor died in Green Oak Township in 1849 and was buried here in the cemetery in New Hudson. After she died, her husband Abraham lived for about the next 7 or 8 years with his daughter Ruth, who was married to Samuel Houghteling. Then after Ruth died, Abraham moved over to Ottawa County, Michigan, and lived with his son James over there. Also buried in the cemetery are Anna Taylor, who married a gentleman named Robert Bell, who may or may not have been a distant relative on her mother's side, and also John Duncan Taylor, whose first wife was buried in the last cemetery that we looked at. He remarried and had more children, and he and his wife are buried in this cemetery here. Many of the descendants of Anna Taylor Bell and John Duncan Taylor are also buried in this Taylor and Bell family plot here in New Hudson, Michigan. We are in Eagle, Michigan, on the north bank of the Grand River a few miles downstream from Grand Ledge, Michigan. James Hugh Taylor and his first wife Harriet Brewer came here in the late 1840s. At that time they had 6 children, and their last 2 children were born here. Robert Winfield Taylor in 1849 and Izuba Zerua Taylor, who was one of my great-grandmothers, in 1851. We can trace the ancestors of Harriet's father, John Brewer, all the way back to the very first boatload of Dutch settlers who came to New Netherlands in the 1620s. Eagle has changed very little in the last 170 years since James Taylor and Harriet Brewer moved here. One is tempted to say there is no there. It is basically just a collection of cornfields and bean fields and the tree line showing the course of the Grand River through this area. A very quiet rural setting with not much to recommend it. A few years later, they moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where Harriet died in 1854. Less than 2 months after Harriet died, James Taylor remarried Chloe Ann Stanzel, the daughter of Nicholas and Susanna Stanzel. At this time, Chloe was a single mom. We do not know who her first husband was. They started their own family right away, the second family for James. They had 6 children. Benjamin, Hattie, and Linus were born in Grand Rapids and Granville area, and then their last 3 children, Fidelia, Donna, and Eliab, were born in Allendale Township. James and Chloe and their family lived around Grand Rapids and Granville until about the end of 1859, when they moved to Ottawa County, Michigan. We're standing on the south bank of the Grand River in the very northernmost part of Allendale Township in Ottawa County, Michigan. The bridge we are looking at is the 68th Avenue Bridge. On the other side of the river is the town of Eastmanville, and about 2 miles east, which is upstream from Eastmanville, is the town of Lamont. Samuel Wilson and Susan Newton and their family moved to the Lamont area sometime in the middle 1850s. Their youngest son was born in Lamont in 1857, and they lived in Lamont until about 1863, when they moved across to this side of the river in Allendale. In the 1800s, there was no bridge across the Grand River here. This was a ferry crossing, and they would have taken the ferry to cross over to this side of the river. We are in the very northwest corner of Allendale Township in Ottawa County, Michigan, on the south bank of the Grand River, just west of the mouth of the Bass River. In the 1800s, there was a riverboat landing at the mouth of the Bass River, and that is where James Hugh Taylor, my great-great-grandfather, brought his second wife, Chloe Stanzel, and all of their children in early 1860. They lived with a handful of other families in this little wedge of the northwest corner of Allendale Township. When the Taylor family moved here, there were fewer than 100 families in all of Allendale Township. Native Americans still camped, hunted, and fished along the banks of the Grand River and the other streams in the area. Around this time, the family began to split up. First, Maria Taylor, the oldest daughter of James' first wife, Harriet Brewer, married Orrin Arnold in 1857 in Granville. In 1860, Orrin and Maria moved to this same corner of Allendale Township and lived with her parents. When Chloe Stanzel married James Taylor in 1854, she already had a young daughter, Rosalie, who was the same age as Azuba. The older Taylor children did not get along with their stepsister Rosalie, and in 1860 she was living with the neighbors rather than with the Taylor family. The Civil War brought the next changes to the Taylor family. In 1861, John, James, Martin, and Chauncey Taylor, the oldest brothers, all enlisted in the 3rd Michigan Infantry. In 1862, Orrin Arnold enlisted in the 6th Michigan Cavalry, leaving his wife Maria at home with 3 little children and pregnant with their 4th. Also in 1862, James Taylor bought 160 acres of land a little more than 2 miles southeast of here from the U.S. government. He was one of the last people to homestead in Allendale Township. In 1863, Maria Taylor Arnold died shortly after giving birth to their 4th child. The children were adopted out to relatives in the Arnold family. After the war, Orrin Arnold remarried and returned to Ontario, where he was born. He raised another family there, and sometime around the turn of the century, he, his second wife, and their children moved to Alberta and homesteaded there, somewhere near Edmonton. He and his second wife are buried in Edmonton, Alberta. We are in the park on the southeast corner of Lake Michigan Drive and 68th Avenue in downtown Allendale, Michigan. To the east of us are the town hall and the fire station. My great-great-grandfather, Samuel B. Wilson, bought 40 acres on this corner in 1863, and he sold it in 1865. In the 1840s and 1850s, most of the land in this part of Allendale was bought from the U.S. government by land speculators, who later sold it off to loggers who would harvest the timber and then in turn sell it to farmers who would farm the land. I believe that Samuel and his sons probably harvested the timber from this land and then sold it. After they sold this land, the family moved a little bit more than 2 miles west down Lake Michigan Drive, and then on the north side there was 800 acres of land that had belonged to Mr. Patty. After he died, the family, rather than selling the land, rented it out to various farmers. Apparently for the rest of his life, Samuel farmed rented land here, and his sons also had farms on this land, just west and north of the 160 acres that my other great-great-grandfather, James Hugh Taylor, bought from the U.S. government in 1862, and these families basically became neighbors in the middle 1860s. We are in a sports park just south of Port Sheldon Street in the eastern edge of Hudsonville, Michigan. Back in 1886, my grandmother, Nettie Wilson, was born in a house on the south side of Port Sheldon Street, a little ways west of here. We do not know exactly which house it was, but we know it was near here. 20 years before that, Ebenezer Wilson III moved to Hudsonville from Kansas with his two youngest daughters, Catherine and Mary Wilson. He farmed somewhere near here. We do not know exactly when they came back from Kansas, but we do know that they were here before 1867. In 1867, his daughters got married. Mary Salome Wilson, his youngest daughter, did not have very good luck with men. She married 7 different men during her life. A couple of those marriages ended up in divorce. Most of her husbands died on her. She did have several children, and their descendants live on today. Catherine Wilson married John Lobdell. They lived in Jenison, just east of here, but within 2 years, Catherine Wilson died, giving birth to their first daughter. She was the first of our relatives to be buried in the Georgetown Cemetery, but she was not the last. After Catherine Wilson Lobdell died, her husband John Lobdell remarried. He and his second wife lived on a farm for many years, about 2 or 3 miles west of here on the south side of Port Sheldon Street, where they raised his daughter and other children of their own. Descendants of Lobdell families still live in western Michigan today. We do not know what happened to Ebenezer III after his daughters married here, but he probably died here. We have no record of him in the 1870 census. He was the first, but not the last, of our relatives to live in Hudsonville, Michigan. We are at the northwest corner of Buchanan Street and 84th Avenue, about a mile from the mouth of the Bass River. The first person to farm this land was Enos Parrish, who came here after the Civil War. He and his sons and grandsons owned a lot of farmland in northern Allendale Township in the late 1800s, and they still farmed in this area well into the 1900s. A schoolhouse was built on this land about where the house now stands. This was the corner of Enos Parrish's farm, and the school was called the Parrish School. Later, Enos's son Wells took over most of this farm, and his brothers also farmed in this area. Wells Parrish became the most prominent businessman in northern Allendale Township. In addition to a lot of farmland, he owned the creamery and also the grist mill where farmers took their grain to be ground. He was so prominent that in the history of Ottawa County there is an extensive write-up about him. Probably in the 1880s, a Seventh-day Adventist missionary came to this area. Wells Parrish and many of his neighbors became Seventh-day Adventists, and we believe that their church also met in the school on this property. We will learn more about these neighbors now, and in our next video, we will learn even more about some of their descendants, and we will meet one of them. Southwest of here was the farm of my great-grandfather Henry Wilson and his wife Azuba Taylor. Henry and Azuba got married in 1867. About the same time Izua's stepsister, Rosalie Taylor, got married. Both of these young ladies were not yet 16 years old, and yet their marriages lasted a lifetime. South of here was the Sheffield farm. James Wilson, the son of Henry and Izuba, married the neighbor girl, Rose Sheffield. Southeast of the Sheffields was the farm of my great-great-grandfather James Hugh Taylor and his second wife Chloe Stanzel. My great-great-great-grandfather Abraham Losey Taylor probably spent his final years at this farm. He died in 1865, and only 8 years later, in 1873, his son James also died of smallpox. Both of these gentlemen were probably buried on this farm. East of the Taylor farm was the Breen farm. We will learn more about the Breen family in our next video. To the east of the Parish farm, where we're now standing, James Mortimer Taylor, a son of James Hugh Taylor, had his farm, and east of the Taylor farm and the Breen farm was the Brown family farm. In 1869, Henry Wilson's adopted sister Harriet Stanley married Abram Bunnell. They lived near Hastings for the rest of their lives, and they still have descendants alive today. Henry's younger brothers, Charles Edgar Wilson and James Lester Wilson, married and moved to Newaygo County north of Grand Rapids. They spent the rest of their lives there and had many children and grandchildren who also lived in that area. The youngest brother, Lewis Wilson, stayed in the Allendale area and eventually moved to Holland and then later north to Muskegon, where he died in 1922. After the Civil War, the four oldest Taylor brothers came back to Allendale and married, and then they began to move all over the place. John moved to Kansas, then to Arkansas, and finally to California. Two of John Taylor's grandchildren became professional baseball players. Taylor Douthit was an all-star center fielder with the St. Louis Cardinals. He played in the 1926, 1928, and 1930 World Series, and he is in the University of California Sports Hall of Fame. James stayed here for a while, then he also went to Arkansas and to California. Martin moved to Ohio and then to South Dakota. Then he came back to Michigan, and finally he also went to California. Chauncey moved to northern Michigan and then to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Eventually he came back to Grand Rapids, and he died in Grand Rapids in 1920. Anna Taylor married Henry Brown and spent most of her life right here on their family farm. Izuba's closest brother, Robert Taylor, married the younger sister of his older brother John, and they moved to Kansas. After his wife died, he moved back to Michigan. Elizabeth Young and her sister came to the United States from England in 1882. Elizabeth earned an MD degree from the Cleveland University of Medicine and Surgery in 1893, and then she went to work with Dr. John Harvey Kellogg at the Battle Creek Sanitarium. She and Robert married in 1896 and moved back to Grand Rapids, where they operated a medical clinic until Elizabeth died in 1904. Robert's son, Harry F. Taylor, became a Seventh-day Adventist minister. He died in 1960 in San Bernardino, California. Chloe Stanzel Taylor remained in Allendale for many years. In the late 1800s, she moved north to Ware Township in Oceana County, Michigan, north of Muskegon, and lived with her youngest daughter, Donna, who had married Hiram Cady. Chloe and Donna died within a year of each other in the early 1900s. They are buried together in Ware Cemetery. We are at the southeast corner of Buchanan Street and 88th Avenue in Allendale, Michigan. My great-grandfather Henry Wilson and his wife Izuba bought this farm around 1895, and they lived here for perhaps 12 to 14 years. Before they bought this farm, they lived on several other farms in Allendale Township and even for a little while in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where Henry worked at a furniture factory. All of their children were born in Allendale except their youngest daughter, who was my grandmother, Nettie. She was born near Hudsonville, a little ways south of here. Around the time their youngest son, James Mortimer Wilson, married in 1908, Henry and Azuba sold this farm and moved to another farm. My father believed that their last farm was near Lamont, but I have been unable to verify this. Henry died of a stroke in Allendale Township in 1915. A few years later, Azuba and her daughter Nettie moved off of that farm to Grand Haven, Michigan. Azuba died in Grand Rapids, Michigan in 1922. We are standing in the Allendale Township Cemetery on the west side of 60th Avenue between Warner Street and the Grand River, which is about a half-mile north of us. Antonin and Titus are exploring the graves of my great-great-grandparents Samuel Wilson and Susan Newton, who were born in Genesee County, New York in the early 1800s, and got married in 1841 in New York. Samuel died here in Allendale in 1885, and Susan died 3 years later in 1888 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Their graves are just south of the south access road into this cemetery. Cemetery records indicate that Samuel B. Wilson was a veteran. If these records are correct, then he was the Samuel B. Wilson who enlisted in Illinois during the Mexican War, served for a few months, and was discharged with a disability. Also buried near Samuel and Susan are their second son, Charles Edgar Wilson, who died in 1902, and one of their granddaughters, Ada Frances Wilson, who died before she was 2 years old. Walking across the cemetery road is another lot where there are some Wilson relatives buried, but there are no grave markers here. So other than the cemetery records, we have no way of knowing who was buried here, but the two boys that I'm looking at are not buried. They are very much alive. We are looking at the Parrish family plot north of the North Access Road in the Allendale Township Cemetery. The Parrish family owned a lot of land just north of the farms of my Wilson and Taylor ancestors. When my great-grandfather Henry Wilson sold his land, he sold it to a member of the Parrish family. A little ways north of here are the graves of Henry and Azuba Wilson and some of their children. These are the graves of my great-grandfather and great-grandmother Henry William Wilson and Azuba Zerua Taylor. Henry died in 1915 and Azuba died in 1922. Buried with them are their young son Henry Luzerne Wilson, who was born in 1873 and lived for a few months. Vernon Ray Wilson, who was born in 1884, lived for about 9 months. Their daughter Hattie Myrtle Wilson, who married George Rawlia. About a year later, she died giving birth to twin daughters. One of the daughters survived and the other is buried here with her mother. Also buried here are Samuel Arthur Wilson and his wife Diana Grace Sullivan. They died in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and they are buried here in Allendale. Toward the back of the cemetery, behind some evergreen trees, is the last grave that we are going to visit in this video. James Mortimer Wilson and his wife Rose Etta Sheffield. Rose died in 1950 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. James died 10 years later in Monmouth, Illinois, near their daughter Esther Wilson.